Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Nelson, here on this wonderful Tuesday afternoon. And I'm a little bit late to, the allotted time that I'm usually here. I apologize for that. We got into an extremely heated debate on the college football playoff format and like the tournament format and how it's structured and just, how the system in place of it is, and it sort of held up the meeting a lot. But if you guys want to hear other people's opinions on college football and like the anything about college football, really, we do have a college football podcast that I highly recommend listening to. Tommy is he's a very, very good show host. He knows a lot about college football, knows the ins and outs way more than I do. So you can get much better opinions from him if you're interested in college football. And if you're interested in football in general, we have so many football podcasts. We have a sports podcast as well that goes live after my podcast. So if you guys are interested on anything football, I recommend tuning in and listening to those guys and what they have to say. So aside from that, however, we do have a lot of things to cover with the NBA. So for starters, Ja Morant ended up leaving the most recent preseason game due to an ankle injury. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that and my thoughts on the injury and what's in store for the Memphis Grizzlies going into this season. And there's also, hold on just 1 second, there were also some celebrity picks that, in the second segment, we're going to talk about some celebrities that picked a team that was going to win the NBA Finals, the finals matchup, as well as who's going to win the MVP. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that as well in the second segment. Then in the third segment, we're going to do a quick recap of all the preseason games that happened the other day, who played well, who didn't play well, and just some stories from the preseason early on for the season. And then in the fourth segment, we're going to cover the WNBA, how there's going to be an elimination game later tonight, and we're just going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that in the fourth segment. And then we also have a special fifth segment that I think is going to be very, very entertaining. So stick around for that if you guys are interested in what that is. And before I begin, I do like to remind everybody that we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show, whether you guys have a hot take, whether you guys have a burning question, something you've been dying to share. We're all ears. If you really want your comment and or question to get noticed, I recommend using Super Chat. Just click on the $ below the chat box and you can send in your comments and donations that way. Really helps the show, makes it way more interactive between myself and you guys. And if Super Chat isn't really your thing, that's okay. You can always use the link displayed below the ticker on every show segment, which is gsmcpodcast.net. And you can send in your comments and or donations that way. Either or really helps the show, and either or makes it much more interactive. So with that out of the way, we can go ahead and focus on the preseason. And I'm mainly going to focus right now on Ja Morant, because in the most recent game, in the most recent preseason game, I almost said postseason, he ended up suffering a right ankle injury, and this eventually led to him leaving the game rather early. And I think this is rather concerning. Morant was suspended 25 games in the last season due to off-the-court randomness and off-the-court stuff I'm sure you guys already know about, and I'm not going to focus on that, obviously. And he also, after returning from suspension, he averaged 26 points, which is fantastic, but that was only 9 games. And then he quickly suffered a shoulder injury right after. And he was, he made his return, but after 18 minutes, he ended up rolling his ankle in a transition and headed to the locker room, according to SportsCenter. And I think this is a big concern. Like, I don't think this is something that should be taken lightly if you're a Grizzlies fan. And to those of you guys who think that Zion is injury riddled, it seems like Ja Morant is just as bad and almost just as injury riddled as Zion tends to be. Because, again, this is almost a whole season that Ja Morant misses out. He's also missed several times before due to ankle injuries, and it's mainly, I think it's a big problem, and I think it's something that shouldn't really get shoved under the rug. because similar to Steph Curry and his ankle injuries, and everyone knows that Steph Curry's got relatively weak ankles, and he tends to get injured a lot there, and it makes sense because of all of his moving and all of his moving around the court, trying to get defenders off of him, all of the plays that the Golden State Warriors run. But it seems like I think that Ja should do a better job in protecting his ankles in these kinds of games. He did end up saying, at least according to Tim McMahon, he ended up tweeting out that Ja Morant said, quote, "I'm good. It's preseason, man," end quote. So it doesn't seem Ja Morant is all that worried about his injuries, but I feel like he's just trying to put the fans at ease with that quote because, again, this is just a common trend with Ja Morant and his injuries and his career so far. I'm actually going to go ahead and see how many injuries he's sustained over the course of his career. And hold on just 1 second. So he's had a shoulder injury that was forced him to sideline. He also had an illness before that, league suspension, another league suspension. Then he hurt his hand, he hurt his hip, and then he hurt his thigh. And then there was also wrist injury in 2023. There was more thigh injuries, and there were 3 ankle injuries in a row in 2022. Then there was also a knee injury in 2022, another ankle injury, another foot injury, another thigh injury. It's like everything that has to do with his legs, which is arguably like the best part of his game, is getting injured rather quickly. And some people, they're saying that he's going to be the modern-day Derrick Rose. I think a more accurate depiction is the modern-day John Wall, because these injuries, while they aren't really that major or as major as Derrick Rose's injuries over his career, they can build up. And one of the things that makes Ja Morant so valuable is the attention he draws towards the paint. He is such an athletic finisher and one of the best finishers around the rim at the point guard position in this league, that if he loses the strength in his legs and can't really help himself from getting injured, that's going to be a problem for him in his career. And this has been a thing that I've noticed him do in almost every single game. It was a problem from the start of his career, and it's still a problem now. It's the way that he lands on some of these dunks. The way that he lands on these dunks, is very unsafe, and he could easily get injured way more severely than how he has been getting injured. And this is part of the reason why I think he's suffered so many foot injuries and leg injuries, because of the way that he lands after dunking the ball and going super, super high above the basket and trying to lay the ball up over everyone. I mean, yeah, it's fantastic, obviously. I'm not going to say that it's not great and that's not valuable and he shouldn't be doing that, but definitely should do a much better job in protecting himself and in protecting his legs, because it's shown and it's proven that the Grizzlies cannot really do much without Ja Morant. It seemed like they were able to do something when a couple of seasons ago, when they went 20-2, I believe, when Ja Morant was sitting out. But aside from that, it's really it's Ja Morant, and you need Ja Morant in order to have a successful season if you are the Memphis Grizzlies. And these injuries are hindering him and they're holding him back. So while it might not be a crucial injury now, what happens if something like this happens around playoff time? Your best ability is your availability. And similar to how I critique Joel Embiid for constantly getting injured in the postseason, you do not want that if you're Ja Morant. And it's you have to be able to stay healthy. You have to find a way to be able to stay healthy. Now, maybe wear a different set of shoes. Maybe wear some high tops instead of the traditional low tops that he wears, because high tops do a bit of a better job in sustaining, not really sustaining injuries, but preventing injuries. It's not guaranteed that an ankle injury isn't going to happen, but there's a better chance that it won't if you have those types of shoes. And also, Steph Curry, when he gets when he gets an ankle injury, and when he tends to get these types of ankle injuries, he also wears an ankle brace so that way he doesn't injure his ankle nearly as severely as you'd expect, and then he can return after a few weeks. So maybe that's something that Ja Morant should consider in adding into, like, you know, the equipment that he wears, like, because I mean, you're going to need some sort of protection down there with the type of athletic plays that he makes, with how much he dunks the ball, with how much he tries to dunk the ball, with how much he goes up over taller defenders and lands a little bit awkwardly. You need that kind of protection over on your legs, because the last thing that you want is for him to actually live up to the title of the modern day Derrick Rose and suffer a very, very serious injury that ultimately prevents him from being the same explosive player that we're all accustomed to seeing. And that would be very tough, especially for Grizzlies fans and people who are a fan of Ja Morant's game. I might not be a fan of what he does off the court, but at the end of the day, he's still a very, very talented player and a very talented finisher around the basket. So I think he needs to take this injury as not necessarily needs to take it seriously, but as a sign, like, oh, okay, I should probably protect myself a little bit better so that way I can remain available for my team. Because he's seen on the sideline just how mediocre his team was without him. And even then, me saying mediocre is a little bit of an overstatement, because they were not a good team without Ja Morant, and they need him. So he needs to make sure that he can stay healthy for them throughout the entire season. So that's all that I really have to say. Again, he says that this isn't really that big of a deal. It's just the preseason, and Tim McMahon also tweeted out that it was a, quote, minor little tweak in his ankle. So it's not something major, but again, at the wrong time, if this happens at the wrong time, it could be detrimental to their season. So it's something that needs to be kept in mind, and something that should not really be swept under the rug and should be taken a little bit more seriously from Ja Morant, at least in my opinion. But that's all I have to say. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of this injury, if you think I'm sort of just being a little dramatic or if I'm blowing it out of proportion. But it is a very legitimate concern. So with that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and go into the second segment, where we talk about some celebrities who have predictions for this season. I'm mainly going to focus on the basketball celebrities and as opposed to like the other celebrities. But if there is some time, I might go ahead and mention what they have to say and whether or not I agree with it or not. But aside from that, I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
And we are back with the second segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this second segment, we are going to be talking about celebrities and their picks on what's going to happen in this season, who's going to win the MVP, as well as what the finals matchup is going to be and who is going to prevail in that finals matchup. So before I begin, however, I do like to remind everybody that we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show. Whether you guys have a hot take, whether you guys have a burning question, something you've just been dying to share, we are all ears. If you really want your comment or question to get noticed, I recommend using Super Chat. You just click on the $ below the chat box, and you can send in your comments and or donations. That way, really helps the show, makes it much more interactive between myself and you guys. Once again, the link is Actually, no, excuse me. You use Super Chat. If Super Chat's not really your thing, then you can go ahead and use the link displayed below the ticker, gsmcpodcast.net, and you can go ahead and send in your comments and or donations that way. And with that out of the way, we can go ahead and go through these celebrity picks. Now, these celebrity picks were posted by House of Highlights, I believe, and they went ahead and they asked their popular followers who they thought was going to end up winning the finals, who would match up in the finals, as well as their pick for the MVP. And we're going to start with the NBA players because I feel like that's, most important. But I just wanted you guys to know exactly where these celebrities were taken from and give credit to House of Highlights for doing this as well. You can go ahead and check their Instagram post if you're interested. But Devin Booker was the first celebrity that they posted about, and his pick for the MVP is not himself. A lot of people you'd be surprised, like you'd think that it would be himself that would pick himself, like he would pick himself for the MVP, and there's nothing wrong with that in my opinion. I think that if he were to pick himself to win the MVP, that just shows incredible confidence in his game and incredible confidence in his team as well, because he also expects his team to be a very solid team. You have to be a good team and you have to be a top team in order to win the MVP. But he didn't pick himself. He instead picked Kevin Durant to win the MVP. And while I do think that there's a chance, I do think it's also a very low chance that ends up happening. Because this Suns team, its biggest strengths are their three core players in Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal. And the rest of the lineup is, they're fantastic role players as well. Again, it's like you can make the argument that this is a failed super team. I think this is just a very talented team with talented isolation players. And, I mean, if you want to call it a super team, I call it a failed super team considering how, everyone sort of expected the Suns to make the finals a long time ago, and then they ended up choking in their home court against the Denver Nuggets. And really, picking Kevin Durant to win the MVP, I wouldn't say it's a bad pick. It's definitely far from the worst pick, but there's other players that are lined up before him to win the MVP than Kevin Durant, especially for this season. And I also don't really see the Suns being able to actually be a high seed and a high enough seed in order for Kevin Durant to actually even win the MVP. And Crucial PG's in the chat. Hey Nelson, any opinions on Daniel Jones? I do not talk about football on this podcast. So if you really want Giants opinions on Daniel Jones, I recommend listening to the football podcast that streams directly before my podcast, as well as I believe we have several other sports podcasts as well. One of the hosts, Jeremy, is also a Giants fan. So if you want his opinions on Daniel Jones, you can go ahead and ask him. I can't talk about that. This is a basketball podcast, and we're going to keep it as a basketball podcast. So, and for his pick on who is going to win or who's going to be in the finals, he obviously picked his own team and the Boston Celtics to make it to the finals, and he picked the Suns in winning the finals. Now, that is definitely not going to happen. If the Suns match up against the Celtics in the finals, by some miracle the Suns manage to pull through and go all the way to the finals, that team is not enough to be able to go up against the Boston Celtics and the matchups that they have, because they have perimeter defenders at practically every single position at the 1 through the 4, meaning they have solid enough defenders to be able to guard Kevin Durant, solid enough defenders to guard Devin Booker, and even Bradley Beal. And when you have that kind of matchup, I don't really think it's ideal for the Suns to be the favorites in that kind of matchup. I mean, Jason Tatum can guard, it's very difficult to guard Kevin Durant, but Jason Tatum could probably do a good job, a decent job. I'm actually going to give Kevin Durant some credit here because he's ridiculous. And he could do a decent job in slowing Kevin Durant down. Really, the matchup that I think is either going to get exploited or going to get abused is whoever is going to match up against Bradley Beal. I feel like Derek White and Drew Holiday are a very good matchup against Bradley Beal, and they can slow Bradley Beal down to a huge halt, especially considering how mediocre Bradley Beal played in the previous postseason. And Devin Booker, I mean, Drew Holiday was guarding Devin Booker in one finals matchup, and Devin Booker ended up dropping 40 points in several games. Didn't end up winning, but still ended up dropping several points, and I believe he had like two 40-point games in that finals matchup. So I don't really think if it was the Suns going up against the Celtics, I don't think the Suns have a remote chance of even winning in that matchup. And another player that gave his predictions was Dwight Howard, and he predicted that the MVP for this season was going to be Joel Embiid. I completely disagree with that. Like, there's no way that Joel Embiid is going to end up winning an MVP over somebody like Jokic. I just don't see that happening at all. And the only reason why he even won the MVP over Jokic that one time was because of reasons that I don't want to get into, but you can go ahead and look up Kendrick Perkins and Joel Embiid's MVP case if you guys are really interested in what he had to say. But it ultimately changed it completely changed the outcome of who was supposed to win the MVP that year. Like, Jokic was ranked number one, the favorite in winning MVP in every single poll. And then once Kendrick Perkins said what he said, then it flipped, and then Joel Embiid ended up being the favorite in every single poll. And I'm just like, no, should not happen. Jokic was robbed that year. He should be standing on 4 straight MVPs right now, but he's not. And in the finals matchup, I actually do think that this finals matchup is going to happen, so I do agree with Dwight. He predicted a Boston versus Denver matchup. However, he predicts that the Boston Celtics would repeat with Jaylen Brown winning the finals MVP. And I don't agree with that at all, mainly because of Jason Tatum's opinions on how he knew he was going to win in the postseason. I do have another episode up where it's Jason Tatum talking about how he knew he was going to win the postseason, if you guys are interested in looking at that video. But Jason Tatum essentially said that once the Denver Nuggets were eliminated, he knew that the Boston Celtics would end up winning in that matchup in whatever matchup the finals would be, because he felt that the Denver Nuggets were a much more difficult matchup compared to every other team in the Western Conference. And that once they got eliminated, Jason Tatum felt like that his team was going to win in the finals in the end. And, excuse me, I don't think that the Celtics are going to end up repeating if this is their specific finals matchup. And if they go up against Denver, I think Denver is going to close them out in about 6 games, I'd say. But mainly because of Jokic, and also because they do have good enough matchups against all of their other players. I mean, I don't really think Kristaps could probably slow down Jokic, but it's also like almost impossible to slow down Jokic. I mean, Rudy Gobert got 40 points dropped on him in Game 6, I believe, and well, not in Game 6, in Game 5, I think it was. And it was a very like, if the defensive player of the year couldn't slow down Jokic in one game, or like in a few games, imagine what Kristaps is going to do matched up against Jokic. I don't think that's a very good matchup that the Celtics look forward to. Not to mention when they sub out Kristaps for somebody like Al Horford, who's relatively old, like one of the oldest players in the league. And since he's old, he's going to be rather slow on his feet. And on the defensive side, he could be a liability against somebody like Jokic. But aside from that, I mean, I do think that the finals matchup is much more reasonable than Devin Booker's finals matchup, where it was his team against the Boston Celtics. But again, to Devin Booker's credit, you'd want Devin Booker to say that his team is going to make the finals, and you want him to say that Kevin Durant is going to win the MVP. So while there's obvious bias, I think, it's the right kind of bias. And maybe don't take an opinion from somebody who's currently on an NBA team right now, because you know that they're going to have some sort of bias. Now, there were also some other celebrities that they mentioned. I mean, Logan Paul and Duke Dennis were also mentioned in this. I'm not going to talk about that at all, because not only are we out of time, but it has nothing to do with they don't have anything to do with basketball. And yeah, they do have opinions. If you're interested in their opinions, you can look at the post on House of Highlights. But aside from that, that's all that I have for this second segment. So now we will go ahead and go into the third segment where I do a quick recap of the preseason games, and I just go ahead and list off the scores, and I go ahead and list off some of the key players in these matchups. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm out of breath for some reason. And in this third segment, we're going to be looking at all of the preseason games that ended up going down yesterday, and we'll go ahead and talk about some of the stories that were around in some of these games, as well as some key players in these matchups. And obviously, since it's preseason, you don't really expect many starters to be playing in the preseason, and that's exactly what happened in this, for the Dallas Mavericks at least, in this matchup against the Memphis Grizzlies. And so, again, I mentioned before that Ja Morant left the game due to an ankle injury. However, he did end up producing 13 points, as well as recording 4 rebounds and 3 assists for the Memphis Grizzlies. He wasn't the leading scorer for the Grizzlies, obviously, since he had to leave early. But aside from that, he was the leading scorer, in the starting lineup for the Memphis Grizzlies. So, assuming he can stay healthy, then it seems like the Memphis Grizzlies are going to be a rather solid team. Now, in this game, the Mavericks, they were chanting out Klay Thompson. They were like, "We want Klay. We want Klay." And it was obviously this is good. This is good coming in from a lot of the Mavericks fans and for the Mavericks and their overall morale in Klay Thompson. If you guys remember the previous season, morale on Klay Thompson wasn't all that high. And over the offseason, you can argue that it got even worse because everyone was talking about Klay Thompson's horrible performance and how he went 0 for 10 or 0 for 11 in that elimination game. I believe it was 0 for 10, but I forget exactly what number it was. But he missed every single shot. And a lot of people, they sort of assumed that this was the end of Klay Thompson and that Klay Thompson was going to, fall off. And this was going to be the fall off for Klay. But to be fair, Klay didn't really play all that bad in the previous season. I mean, he still shot around 39% from 3, which I think is very solid. It's just, and on top of that, the confidence that he's getting from these fans could also help him throughout majority of the season, because now he has a fandom that's completely behind him and that supports him in all of his, despite all of the mess ups that happened last season, they want him to succeed. And when a shooter has confidence, that is one of the most dangerous shooters ever. And it doesn't matter how mediocre they could be. When they have confidence, and it seems like every shot goes in. I mean, you can look at Grayson Allen for an example. I remember on Christmas, he was so confident, he ended up making, I think, 7 threes in the first quarter or something like that. It was a ridiculous number and something that has never even been done before. And even, there's so many random players that have recently scored 40 points or even 30 points or 50 points. Eric Gordon is one of the players that comes to mind, where when he was on, he was on. And this is sort of like a trend that happens now with a bunch of shooters in this league. Whenever a shooter is confident, they're incredibly dangerous. And this is good for the Mavericks. Now, for the Mavericks, Jaden Hardy was their best player, ended the game with 21 points and also recorded 8 assists as well. And it seems that a lot of players on the Dallas bench actually produced pretty efficiently. I mean, you have Oliver I can't pronounce that middle name. Maxence, forgive me if I messed up that last name, Prosper, and he ended that game with 14 points. And then there was also Jazian Gortman, who ended the game with 19 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists, along with 4 steals as well. So it seems that there is a chance that the Mavericks could actually have some sort of depth. Again, we have to see how the preseason plays out, and again, how the rotations are going to play out for this Dallas Mavericks team. But if they have a solid bench, and they have a solid bench that can produce, that's one good thing that they have going into this next season that they previously didn't have. Because in the finals matchup and throughout most of the playoffs, it was really you give Luka and Kyrie the ball and everyone gets out of the way and gets ready to set up the play. And it worked up until the point when they matched up against a team that was full of perimeter defenders and ended up slowing them down. Mainly slowing Kyrie down. They couldn't really slow down Luka because it's very difficult to slow down Luka, but they did slow down Kyrie. So in this matchup, I mean, obviously the Mavericks ended up losing. The score was 121 to 116 in favor of Memphis, but they showed some good things in this loss. So, and that's really like the more important thing when looking at preseason losses. Like if you can show positivities despite losing, then you're in a much better spot than a lot of teams would expect. Next matchup is the Orlando Magic against the Pelicans. Pelicans ended up winning 106 to 104, and Zion ended up playing in this game, which I'm a little bit surprised. I expected the Pelicans to be resting all of their starters, but no, DeJounte Murray, CJ McCollum, and Zion Williamson ended up playing in this matchup. Zion, he scored 16, ended up with 8 rebounds as well. DeJounte Murray only had 6 points, but he did record 6 assists. None of them played more than 20 minutes, so I guess that's something that's really solid, but still, I don't agree with starting or even playing starters in the preseason because, again, there's a huge chance, especially with Zion, that some of these players get injured. So I don't really agree with that. Now, Jordan Hawkins for the Pelicans ended the game with 18 points, 2 assists, and 1 rebound as well. And that was really like all of the solid performances coming in from the bench. And again, Zion, he ended up going 8 for 11. I forgot to mention that too, by the way. Daniel Tice was also pretty solid. Ended the game with 6 for 7 from the field, 13 points, and 1 for 1 from 3. They're going to need a lot more shooting coming in from Daniel Tice, so that way that sort of allows Zion Williamson to dominate in the painted area and in the restricted area a little bit more easily, as opposed to a team that might have a rim protector in the future. Again, we have no idea whether or not the Pelicans are going to address their rim protector situation, but so far it looks like they have a very solid team, but we'll have to see as the season develops. Paolo Banchero also ended up playing in this game. He ended up playing 22 minutes, which I don't agree with. Again, I am heavily against playing the starters in a preseason game. But he did play rather well. He ended up being the Magic's leading scorer, go figure. Ended the game 5 for 7 from the field with 15 points. So very solid outing from Paolo. I expect a big season coming in from him. And I don't really think it's going to be all that popular, however. I think he's still going to remain one of the league's more underrated players. And that's pretty sad. Now, Jalen Suggs, I expected a little bit more, and I expect a big season from him, but this game, 3 for 10 from the field, 11 points, definitely not ideal. But still, he does bring some value to the Orlando Magic with his defense. But if he can provide offensively and be a driving force for this team, then they could probably go far in this Eastern Conference, which really seems up for grabs on whoever is going to match up against the Boston Celtics. And really, the Celtics are going to be the favorite to make it to the conference finals. And if you're able to beat them, then it's basically anybody's game in the Eastern Conference. And not really much notable performances to come out of this game. No one on the Orlando Magic scored more than 20 points. And nobody on the Pelicans scored more than 20 points. So it was a pretty meh kind of game. Next game on this list is the Thunder. They ended up matching up against the San Antonio Spurs. And the Spurs, they were smart. They did not play Victor Wembanyama at all in this game, which they most definitely shouldn't. Victor should not even touch the court in a preseason game. We already know how good Victor is. And they also have several rookies that they also need to sort of develop and several players that they should improve on to sort of help Wemby out in this situation. Chris Paul also didn't play, which I think is also very important to note. But despite from that, Julian Champagne, I have no idea how to pronounce his name. I usually call him Champagne, which is kind of funny. But Julian ended up scoring 22 points and ended the game with 3 rebounds as well. So very fantastic game coming in from him. And he plays small forward, so who knows exactly what kind of value they're going to get out of him in this season. And let's see, some other players that ended up playing pretty well. Malachi Branham, forgive me if I messed up that last name. He ended the game with 12 points as well. And again, this was another game where it was just like, testing the bench, seeing exactly how much depth they actually have and who's going to make the rotation for the Spurs. And for the Thunder, they ended up starting some of their starters. Jalen Williams was in the game. Chet Holmgren played for only 9 minutes, which I think is a very solid number. I mean, he shouldn't be playing more than 12. And honestly, Jalen Williams should not be playing 17 minutes in a preseason game. Shai Gilgeous didn't play, which is fantastic. Good on them. But in the allotted time that they were playing, Jalen Williams ended up scoring 18 points in 17 minutes, and Chet Holmgren scored 10 points in 9 minutes. So that's some pretty solid production from those starters. And again, it is a preseason game, but still very important and very solid production coming in from them in this preseason game. Then there was also Dylan Jones, ended the game with 17 points, 8 for 11. And AJ Mitchell for the Oklahoma City Thunder ended up leading the entire team in scoring with 19 points and going 8 for 13 from the field. And again, another game where just a bunch of bench players were being substituted in and just figuring out exactly what the depth situation is. And finally, the Utah Jazz ended up playing their first NBA team in the preseason. They ended up playing the New Zealand Breakers. Forgive me if I messed up the pronunciation of that team. But obviously, an NBA team is going to easily beat a team from New Zealand. And in this matchup against the Houston Rockets for the Jazz, excuse me, I don't know why Lauri Markkanen is playing 24 minutes in this game, but he did. And he ended with 17 points and also ended up shooting 3 for 11 from the field. So a majority of his points ended up coming at the line. And again, I just don't think Lauri Markkanen should be the player that you should be playing in the preseason. Jordan Clarkson played pretty well, 14 points, 5 of 9 from the field. And let's see, Keontae George also played pretty solid, 3 for 7 with 13 points as well. And he ended the game with 4 assists, so he was the rookie leader in assists, and that was the only stat that Victor Wembanyama did not dominate in the previous season. And again, just another game where everybody was sort of playing all their players. And Sengun was also playing in this game, which I also don't agree considering how he came off of a very bad injury in the previous season. So I think maybe saving him and not playing him for 22 minutes would be the goal. But aside from that, the Rockets, they ended up doing what they're doing. And they did claim that they have one of the deeper teams in the NBA. So why not try and use this deep team in the preseason matchup? It does not make any sense to me. But he did end up scoring 17 points, ended up recording 4 assists and 4 rebounds, along with 3 steals and a block. And then Jalen Green was also playing pretty well. He played 20 minutes and ended the game with 21 points. And he also shot very efficiently from the field, shooting 50% overall. And really, that's sort of like what we expect now from Jalen Green. He did go on a ridiculous streak last season where he was just dropping random 30-point games, efficient 30-point games as well, and making turnaround three-pointers at a ridiculous, like he did that several times in some of these games, and it was just like his confidence was all the way up here. And again, like I said before, a shooter with confidence is a very dangerous basketball player, and they need to expect that same production coming in from him almost every single night if they want to make something out of this season. And let's see, Amon Thompson also played in this game, shot 6 for 8 from the field, ended with 13 points as well, and also was able to record 3 rebounds and 1 assist. But again, this was just another game where everybody was sort of playing most of their bench and trying to see who was going to fit in the rotation. But for having a deep bench, it doesn't really seem like they have a deep bench. A lot of the bench players were missing a lot of shots in this game. But aside from that, that's all that I'm going to talk about with the preseason. I'm not going to recap the 76ers matchup against the New Zealand Breakers and that team. Aside from the fact that Jared McCain actually ended up shooting like pretty well and was a surprise for some Philly fans, mainly because a lot of people don't really expect much from McCain. But while he didn't shoot all that well from the field, 5 for 14, he did shoot rather well from 3, going 4 of 9 from 3, and ended the game with 15 points. So take that with a grain of salt. But that's all that I have for these preseason matchups. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the WNBA semifinals matchup that's going to happen later tonight. And I'll talk about that right after this short break, so be sure to stay tuned.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
And we are back with the fourth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this fourth segment, we're going to talk about the matchup that's going to happen later tonight in the WNBA. And it's going to be a little bit of a shorter segment because I have a much longer segment planned out for the fifth segment. Again, stay tuned for that if you're interested to figure out what that fifth segment is. But it's Elimination Day. So the Sun and the Lynx, they're going to match up in Game 5 in the final game of the semi-final round for the WNBA. And this, by far, has been the most competitive series in the entire WNBA playoffs. By far, as of right now, it's been the most competitive series. This series has gone back and forth, and it's the only series that ended up going back and forth. I mean, most of the series in the WNBA ended up ending like this. And ever since, people sort of started to find out that the WNBA is rather top-heavy, a lot of people's interest on these games has sort of completely decreased. That, along with the elimination of Caitlin Clark, not many people are really tuning into these playoff games as much as they thought, I guess you could say. Even though, I didn't really think that a lot of people were going to tune in after Caitlin Clark got eliminated, because she, like it or not, she is the face of the WNBA, and might not be the best player, but the face of the WNBA. That is 100% for certain. But this series has gone back and forth. The Connecticut Sun ended up stealing the game. They ended up stealing Game 1, and then the Lynx ended up tying the series back at 1-1 in Game 2. So now this was the perfect opportunity for Connecticut to close out the series, having both games at home. But the Lynx ended up winning in the first away game that they played against the Connecticut Sun in Game 3. And that put the Connecticut Sun in a little bit of a hole, because now the Connecticut Sun, they were expected to win back-to-back in order to advance into the postseason. And they played the next game at home. They played Game 4 at home, which they ended up winning. But now they have to go back over to Minnesota, and they have to close out the series away. And this is sort of where most NBA teams end up faltering and end up losing, because they do end up getting the home court advantage, but then the minute they lose that home court advantage against a much more competent team, then they fizzle out. So it's really tough for me to decide exactly who's going to end up winning in this matchup, because the way I see it, if you go to an elimination game, the teams are evenly matched. And this applies for the NBA as well. If you go into a Game 7, but for the WNBA in a Game 5, it means that the teams are neck and neck and they're evenly matched. And chances are, whichever team has the best player on the floor in the final game is going to win the game. Almost always, this is the case. And this, this happened, like a very, very solid example of this is in 2020 when the Clippers matched up against the Denver Nuggets. And that series went to 7 games, and the teams were evenly matched. And the best player on the floor that night was Jokic. And surprise, surprise, the Denver Nuggets ended up winning. It also didn't help the Clippers that the second best player on the court was Jamal Murray. So that also impacted their loss as well. And even in several other playoff series, in fact, when Portland matched up against the Denver Nuggets back in 2019, I believe it was, when Kawhi Leonard was still on the Toronto Raptors, the series ended up going into 7 games. And the best player on the floor was CJ McCollum. It wasn't Damian Lillard, but it was CJ McCollum. And CJ McCollum ended up closing out the game for Portland, and they ended up advancing. So 9 times out of 10, the best player on the floor is going to end up winning. Whichever team has the best player on the floor is going to end up winning that Game 7. And even in 2016, in the NBA Finals, the best player on the floor for the Cavs and in general was LeBron James. And that team ended up winning the NBA Finals as a result of that. So this game is going, like, similar to those series, I think this game is going to go down to whichever team has the best player and the best scorer on the floor. And judging off of the last game, it seems like the best player on the court for this one is going to be Nafisa Collier. So I feel like the Lynx, they have a very, very, very good chance of winning this game. Because in the last matchup, Nafisa Collier ended the game with 29 points and 13 rebounds. Just a masterclass coming in from her. And if she continues to perform like that, and if she plays she doesn't even have to go and drop 29 points. If she drops around like maybe, I'd say 24 and still gets 13 rebounds, the rest of the team is going to follow suit because the rest of the team is going to have home court advantage in this matchup. Now, the Suns, if they want to even win this game, they're going to have to get help from absolutely everybody. And they got that in the previous matchup, but it was at home, right? So they had 4 players in the starting lineup have 15 points or more. And obviously, fantastic production from the starting lineup, but that is what you need when you have home court advantage, and that's what should have happened in Game 3. But unfortunately, they ended up losing in Game 3, and again, one of the big reasons why they ended up losing was because, I mean, they did have a very solid outing in the starting lineup, but the bench just there was not enough depth on that bench, and part of one of the big reasons why they actually had a lot of players in scoring in the starting lineup in that game was because their bench was rather weak. But the scoring wasn't all that efficient in that previous outing. Now, in Game 4, the team as a whole ended up playing much more efficiently than they did in Game 3, excuse me, I'm used to the NBA playoff format, so I apologize for that. But in Game 3, they did not shoot nearly that efficiently. But everybody else on the court, I mean, they shot 53% from 3 and 53% from the field. Like, that is a very, very tough team to beat. A team that's shooting 53% from the three-point line. That is a very tough team to beat. And it's sort of like, they have to reproduce that kind of efficiency on the road in an elimination game. Not many players are going to be able to meet the moment like that, let alone on the road. And I think that's a little bit too much of a task for the Connecticut Sun. So if any team is to have the best chances of advancing in this WNBA playoffs, it's going to be the Lynx. And it's going to be because of Nafisa Collier, who's going to close out the game. Those are my thoughts. Again, could be completely wrong. I wouldn't be mad if I'm completely wrong, because that would mean Connecticut, the state that I'm in right now, would end up seeing a WNBA finals, and they would have a chance to go up against the Liberty. Now, when they go up against the Liberty, or whichever team goes up against the Liberty, I think the Liberty are going to end up prevailing just because I feel like that team is incredibly stacked and everybody on the roster can perform, and as well as Sabrina and Brenna Stewart. Now, Brenna Stewart's been a little bit shaky in some of these games, it seems like it. So against the Lynx, a team that's notorious for having good defense, maybe Brenna Stewart might suffer and it might actually be a more competitive series than this sort of matchup right here. But this game is going to happen at 8 o'clock. It's going to be on ESPN2 for any of you guys who are interested. So, and I'll definitely recover this game once the playoff game concludes. So tomorrow I'm going to cover the game and the results of the game. So if you guys are interested in that, be sure to tune into the next podcast tomorrow. But aside from that, that's all that I really have to say about the WNBA playoffs and their matchups. So now we're going to go ahead and go into the fifth segment where I talk about Karl Anthony Towns and his top 5 power forwards in NBA history. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned. And we are back with the fifth and the final segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this final segment, I'm going to be looking at Karl Anthony Towns' top 5 power forwards in NBA history, and we're going to go straight into this. So, wrong slide. All right, here we go. So, the list, I don't know if this is in any particular order, but I'm just going to put it in the order that it's listed. So at 1, it's Dirk Nowitzki, which I don't agree with. And number 2, Kevin Garnett, which again I don't agree with. Tim Duncan, who I think is in the completely wrong spot. This guy, who I don't want to talk about. And Charles Barkley. So let's break down this list from top to bottom. So Dirk Nowitzki, obviously Dirk Nowitzki is, in my opinion, a top 3 power forward of all time. But I have him at 3. And really, the best power forward in NBA history should be this man right here, Tim Duncan. He by far has the most accolades out of any power forward. He has like the most team accomplishments. He also has a history of winning every single time. And every single season that he's been in, he's made the postseason. And really, there is no reason for Tim Duncan to not be number 1 on anyone's list when you're talking about a power forward. Some people can make an argument that Tim Duncan is a center, and I do understand that, but he was, when you look at Basketball Reference, he was listed at power forward. So I think that this kind of, actually no, I lied. I have Dirk at 2nd, and then I have Kevin Garnett at 3rd. And mainly, the big problem that I have with this list is Tim Duncan not being number 1. Again, I don't know if this list is in order, like in the order that he thinks is the best to the worst, but he should have been the first power forward mentioned, if anything. And with Dirk Nowitzki, yes, I do understand the argument for him being like the best. He does have one of the craziest championships ever won when he matched up again, when he beat the Miami Heat. He was also able to sweep Kobe Bryant and the Lakers that ended up coming off of back-to-back championships. Also ended up beating the Thunder with Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Russell Westbrook in the process as well. And that was a very, very tough road to the finals, which was capped off by beating LeBron James and the Miami Heat, a team that everyone thought was going to win the finals that year. But, of course, LeBron ended up playing really, really bad in that. In fact, really, really bad is probably like a huge overstatement on how he played. Like, he was awful in that postseason. It was so bad that people still talk about it to this day. But again, like, I would have him either 2 or 3, and I have a really difficult time with Kevin Garnett because on one end, Kevin Garnett, he's dominant on both sides of the ball, which is something that Dirk Nowitzki wasn't really all that dominant in. He was dominant on the offensive side, without a doubt, but on the defensive side, he was a liability. So I'm not entirely sure whether or not I would pick between the two on who I would rather have, but if I was to build a team around and to have a power forward to build my team around, I think I would go for Kevin Garnett, who is a much more versatile kind of power forward and one that can end up being a good player on offense as well as a good player on defense. But the one thing that's really docking me from putting him at number 2 is the fact that he only won one NBA championship. And that championship that he won was with a super team with Paul Pierce, Ray Allen, and Rajon Rondo. And I don't really think that championship should have more weight than the championship that Dirk Nowitzki ended up winning, on top of the fact that Kevin Garnett did not win the Finals MVP in that Finals matchup. And on top of that, he was also eliminated from the first round of the playoffs, I believe, 6 years in a row with the Timberwolves. Again, I'm not really holding that to him because he had no help, and that Timberwolves team was just bad aside from Kevin Garnett. It was a miracle that they even made the postseason. So, again, have a really, really difficult time in putting him in the 2 spot, but I wouldn't be opposed if anyone put him at top 2. And that's really sort of like the big debate with this list. And then there's this guy. Now, Karl Malone, yes, he was a fantastic basketball player, but I'm sure all of you know why he's one of the least favorite NBA players in the history of the NBA. And I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about strictly basketball. He is a playoff choker. Like, that is one thing that never gets talked about when we talk about this guy. He is a notorious playoff choker. Every single season that he's made the postseason, his points, his efficiency, his production, they all drop completely off a cliff. It's every single postseason. You can go ahead and look up the stats. Every single time he makes it to the postseason, he ends up playing worse than how he played in the regular season. And a big reason why people give him this top 5 power forward spot is because of his longevity and his ability. You know, he did win the MVP for one year, I believe it was. And again, like, yes, he was a fantastic player. He's a Hall of Famer. But still, I just cannot really put him in a top 5 spot when in the brightest of moments, he ends up playing worse and worse and worse every single time. I cannot do that. I just don't feel right doing that. And I would actually have preferred somebody like Giannis being in the top 5 power forward rankings. Because yes, Giannis is already a top 5 power forward. Like, he's already proven that to me. His averages between compared to Karl Malone, they're pretty similar. For his career, Giannis ended up averaging 23 points per game to Malone's 25 points per game. But a big reason why the production isn't greater is because of the first few years where Giannis wasn't the caliber player that he is now. And he averages like 0.3 rebounds less than Malone. He averages more assists than Malone, averages more blocks, averages better efficiency from both the 3-point line and the field, like overall from the field. His effective field goal is also much higher. And on top of that, Giannis plays defense. That is one of the things that, yes, Karl Malone, you could argue that he was a pretty solid defender, but a big reason why he was so talented was because of his scoring ability. And in my eyes, Giannis can do just that. And even so, Giannis elevates his play in the postseason. We've seen that because he's won the Finals MVP. And again, you can make the argument that it was because a lot of people got hurt. It doesn't matter. When there was an opportunity and there was a time, he was there. And he proved that. And that's something that Malone does not have on his legacy, a championship ring or a Finals MVP. Meanwhile, Giannis has the championship MVP. He also has the regular season MVPs, the same amount as Karl Malone. I also made a mistake. Malone had 2 MVPs as opposed to 1. I apologize for that. But Giannis also has 2, as well as having a defensive player to his resume as well. He was also selected all defensive team more times than Malone did. And really the only thing that I guess you can make the argument for, let me just go ahead and go back to this guy right here, is the fact that he has longevity and he played a much longer career than Giannis. But give Giannis time, and I guarantee you he's going to be a top 5 power forward. He should be a top 5 power forward already, and this guy should not even be on this list. I don't agree with it at all. I think Giannis should be on this list as opposed to this guy, especially because of those postseason performances. I mean, they were just awful. Look it up. Happens all the time to him. Awful. And then on the 5th is Charles Barkley. I don't really have much to say. I definitely think he should be in the top 5, but in the bottom half of the top 5, because he is one of those players that actually completely changed the game. There was a rule that was implemented towards the end of his career where it was like, you cannot have your back to the basket for a certain prolonged period of time, right? And the big reason for that was because Charles Barkley would abuse that. Like, he would straight up have his back to the basket for more than 10 seconds and just bully whoever is down low. And the NBA had to completely amend that rule. And when you get a rule amended strictly to slow you down, it means you change the game, and it means you need to be remembered as a top player at your position. It's just that simple. And it's a big reason why a lot of people, they give Curry a lot of credit, because a lot of people say that he changed the game. They also give other players like, Iverson credit, Wilt Chamberlain credit as well for a lot of rule changes, because of just, they implemented rules to try and slow you down. Like, you have to be really, really good for the NBA to completely revamp its rules just to slow you down. And you have to be remembered for that. So I really don't have any problem with Charles Barkley being on this top 5 list. He changed the game. Only thing that he doesn't have to him is a championship ring. I'm not going to bully him on that, mainly because he already gets bullied by Shaq on live TV about how he doesn't have a championship ring. But really, he should not be on this list. He should not be on this list, and all of you know why. But that's all that I really have about this segment. Again, let me know in the comments what you guys think of the top power forwards on this list. Again, I firmly believe that Giannis should be a top 5. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of that. If you guys think Giannis deserves the top 5 power forward, or if you think it's a little bit too early for that. But that's all that I have to say. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It really makes a difference. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for more content and updates. And as usual, we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show, whether you guys have a hot take, burning question, something you've been dying to share. We're all ears. If you really want your comment or question to get noticed, I recommend using Super Chat. You just click on the $ below the chat box and you can send in your comments and donations that way. If Super Chat's not really your thing, that's okay. You can always use the link displayed below the ticker, gsmcpodcast.net, and you can send in your comments and or donations that way. Either or really helps the show. That's all that I have today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am your host, Nelson, and as always, take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee